Following on from the last video, let's look at some further ways you can control your rows and columns. We're going to look at selecting multiple rows and columns, deleting unwanted ones, hiding them, freezing them, and grouping them. There are two ways to select more than one row or column. First, if the rows or columns you want to select are all next to each other, then simply click on the first one and with the mouse button held down, drag the cursor along to the last one. You'll see the rows or columns being highlighted. You can then right-click on a selected column to access the menu if you want. If the rows or columns are not all next to each other, click on the first one, then hold down the Control key, Command on the Mac, and click on the ones you want. By default, the sheet has columns from A to Z and rows from 1 to 1000. Sometimes you only use a few rows and columns, and you have the option of deleting the rows and columns you're not using. This is mainly just a visual thing, but it does help focus the users of your sheet on the area being used. It looks a little bit tidier and can help it load a bit faster. To do this, just select the columns you don't need. As I explained before, right-click and select Delete Columns. You can always add columns again by selecting the last column, right-clicking and choosing Insert one column to the right. If you want to insert more than one, select the number of columns you want. Right-click and select Insert X columns to the right. Deleting unwanted rows is a similar process. Select the rows you don't need. Right-click and select Delete Rows. You'll then be left with just the cells you want. You can also add more rows again, and Sheets give you a quick way to do this. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Add button, and next to it, a number plus more rows at the bottom. Let's add 5 extra rows. Type in 5 in the box and click Add. The extra rows will appear at the bottom. Note, it will copy the formatting of that last row, so you may have to reformat them. In the same menu as we used above to insert and delete rows and columns, you'll find the option to hide rows or hide columns. If a column is hidden, between the two visible columns, you will see 2 little triangles, for example, here between F and H, showing you that there's a hidden column there. To unhide, you can either click on the little triangles between the columns, or you can select the columns either side of the hidden one, says, and right-click and then select Unhide Columns. If you've got lots of rows or columns, when you move along to the right or down, the previous rows or columns disappear, as you can only see a limited amount of these on the screen at any one time. This is a particular problem with row or column headers. For example, you scroll down your sheet and then forget what the numbers in the columns relate to. Fortunately, there's a way to freeze the initial rows or columns so that they are always visible wherever you are on the sheet. Here we have the points scored by players in a league. So first I want to freeze the first row, which shows the game and total information. Click on a cell in row 1, click on the View menu, then Freeze. You have the option of freezing one row, first 1, 2 rows, first 2, or if you were on a row further down, you can freeze all the rows up until and including that row. For this example, I just want the first row, so I click on one row. Scrolling down, and I can see that the first row always stays visible, even when I get to the bottom row. Next, I want to freeze the first column with the player numbers freezing a column is similar to before. Click on a cell in column A, then click on the View menu, then Freeze, then one column. As you can see now, column A always stays visible. There's a shortcut to freeze rows or columns. For example, to freeze the header row, hover over the line at the bottom of the first row, and when you see the hand icon, drag it down to the row you want to freeze. You can do the same for columns. Click on the line with the row numbers and drag it to the right. To unfreeze rows or columns, go to the View menu and Freeze, and select either no rows or no columns. Alternatively, you can grab the freeze line when the hand symbol appears and move it to the top of the first row, which will remove the row freezing. Sometimes we have large spreadsheets where we want to work with only certain rows or columns. Sheets gives the option to group rows or columns, allowing you with one click to show and hide numerous rows and columns, rather than having to go into the menus and hide the ones you want. As an example, we have a list of classes which contains key dates for when the exams, reports and certificates have to be done. It's divided into 3 terms, and the administrator sometimes wants to work with the data for the whole year, but also sometimes only for a specific term. So what we can do is group the columns for each term together. First, highlight the columns you want to group by highlighting the tops of the columns. In this case, they are columns B to D. Right-click on the selected columns and select View More Column Actions. Then group columns B to D. You'll see a line with a little box with a minus sign in it. This shows the columns which are grouped, and also that the columns are visible. Note the column with the box in it, column A, isn't part of the grouped columns. To hide the group of columns, just click on the little box. This will hide the grouped columns, and the box will change to a plus sign to show the columns are hidden. To view the columns again, just click on the plus sign. We can set up more than one group of columns here. I've set up 3, 1 for each term. Note, I've added empty columns in column E and I. The reason for this is that you can't have groups of columns that are next to each other. In other words, you can't have a group for columns B to D and then another from E to G, as D and E are next to each other. And it just combines the two into one large group, B to G. To get around that, I add a spacer column, as you can see in column E. We can also group rows in a similar way. Select the rows you want by highlighting the rows. Here, I have 2 types of classes, A and B, and I want to group the B classes to be able to work just with the A ones. Right-click and select Group Rows 8, 12. As before, this shows which rows are grouped and shows that the rows are currently visible. Click on the minus sign to hide the group of rows. We can change which rows are grouped. If you want to remove a row or column, just highlight it and right-click. Then select Ungroup Row or Column. You can see that row 12 is now not part of the group. We can also do the same for multiple rows. If you want to remove the grouping, just highlight the rows or columns. To remove a set of grouped rows or columns, right-click on the square symbol to the side of the row or above the column and click Remove Group. If you right-click on the square icon, you can also expand all the column groups, showing all the data in one go, or do the opposite and collapse them all in one go. Finally, you can also move where the square button is, either to the left or right for columns, or top or bottom for rows.